takes pleasure in attracting a stellar list of speakers that address today's most relevant issues. The club's place as a refuge for rich discussion and networking has never wavered after 123 seasons.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Hello, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Nadia Macphail, and I'm the president of the Canadian Club Toronto, and I'm national leader for tech, media, telecom, and consumer markets at PwC Canada. Today, we are connected virtually, but it's important to recognize the land on which Canadian Club Toronto sits and where many of us live and work. We're gathered on the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and previously the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. Today, in celebration of International Women's Day, it's especially important that we take a moment to honor the contribution of the women of these nations in building up family, community, society, and most importantly, for caring for the water and land in a way that allows us to continue to gather today. Today's discussion features an incredible panel of women who have been first in their field. Despite women's growing participation and leadership in all facets of our lives, Canadian women represent only 35% of all legislators and less than 20% of directors on corporate boards. And in the face of additional pressures and challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic, how do we maintain the years of progress that women have fought for? Before we hear from our panelists, here's some information on how you can participate with us today. The click here to switch stream button is available to you if you find that your internet is slow. The video quality may reduce, but the audio should stay strong. And we do want your questions today. So once you click the questions tab, you can just enter your questions in the little window and they will go straight to our moderator. Thank you to today's event sponsors, Canadian Bankers Association and PwC. We are grateful for your support of today's important discussion. The Canadian Club is a nonprofit and we've been gathering together for 124 years and we could not do that without the support of our sponsors. Now to introduce today's panelists. Kluane Adamek is the Assembly of First Nations Yukon Regional Chief. Katie Taylor is Chair of the Board for RBC. Nadia Theodore is Senior Vice President, Global Government and Industry Relations for Maple Leaf Foods. And today's discussion will be moderated by Tanya van Biesen, Senior Vice President, Global Corporate Engagement at Catalyst, and a Director of the Canadian Club. One of the club's traditions that has not changed in this virtual world is a toast to our country that we do at the start of every event. So if you have a glass of water or coffee nearby, join me in raising to the screen and toasting to Canada. To Canada.
Canada.
Tanya, I'll turn the Canadian Club podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Anita. Welcome, everybody, today. We are delighted to be having this conversation today in celebration of International Women's Day. And before we, as a group of panelists, get started, we also would like to, or I would like to invite my panelists, as well as everybody on the line today, to raise a glass and a toast to women in celebration and recognition of International Women's Day 2021. So here's to all of you. And as I say, welcome. And I'm going to have the opportunity to introduce more formally my panelists in a second. But I want to talk a little bit about the history of International Women's Day, because I do sometimes get the question, why do we still celebrate this day, Tanya? What's it all about? So International Women's Day, for those who are aware and those perhaps who are not aware, has been observed actually since the early 1900s. And it was a way for women to press for progress, for women's rights, and for freedoms in society. And over the course of the last century, in fact, there were many activities and initiatives undertaken in countries around the world in support of International Women's Day. But fast forward to the beginning of the new millennium. So in the year 2000, in fact, what we found is there was very little activity occurring for International Women's Day around the world. The world had kind of moved on. And in many spheres, feminism was no longer a popular topic, despite the fact that gender parity had not been achieved, and that in many parts of the world, women were still oppressed. So here we are in 2021, and we are in fact marking the 110th anniversary, formally, of International Women's Day. So I'd like to just reflect on what we see. On the very positive side of the ledger, clearly women have made great strides. Around the globe, we have female astronauts, we have women prime ministers, we have schoolgirls that are being welcomed into university. Women can work and can have a family. We have more women in the boardroom and greater equality in legislative rights, and an increased critical mass of women who are impressive role models in every aspect of life. So one might think, well, we've gained true gender equality. Yet women are still not paid equally to that of their male counterparts. Women are not present in equal numbers in business or politics, and globally, women's education, health, and economic security, and the violence against them is worse than that of men. And so each year, International Women's Day is actually a way of inspiring all of us, men and women around the world, to celebrate women while continuing to call for gender parity. And I'm honored today to be joined by a group of panelists, a group of Canadian women who are very much these impressive role models in every aspect of life. And what I hope we can do today over this next hour is to celebrate their accomplishments, and in particular their professional firsts, but also to learn from them on how Canada can translate their firsts into pathways for many more women to come. So I'll start with introductions. Kluane Adamek. Kluane Adamek is an Assembly of First Nations Yukon Regional Chief, and she is the youngest ever woman to serve as a regional chief in the Assembly of First Nations. Welcome, Kluane. Nadia Theodore, Senior Vice President, Global Government and Industry Relations at Maple Leaf Foods, is one of the first Black women to lead a Canadian diplomatic mission. Welcome, Nadia. And Katie Taylor, Chair of the Board of the Royal Bank of Canada, the first woman to lead a major international hotel company, and actually the first woman to chair a Big Five bank in this country. Welcome, Katie. So to get us started, you are all firsts in your industries and in your communities. When you reflect on your path to first, what are the one or two most important things that helped you to get there? And Kluane, maybe I can start with you.
Thank you so much, and I'm really excited. I have been really excited to join, of course, these incredible women that we're talking and sharing with today, and of course all those who are joining online. I'm coming at you live, so to speak, from Whitehorse, Yukon, Kwanlin-Dun, and Ta'anquichan traditional territories. Certainly for me, in terms of this whole concept of firsts, in a lot of ways, it really does link back to the teachings that we have here in specifically in the Yukon. We're a matrilineal people, and we have always been. And so the responsibilities as women to community, to clan, to family, and to nation has always been really important. And so some of the, I would say, the moments of reflection for me that have always given me the strength in terms of pressing forward have always been to remind myself of who I am and where I come from, and the strength of all those women who have come before me. And I wanted to share just really quickly I am the youngest, serving female regional chief of the Assembly of First Nations. But in our region in the Yukon, I'm the third. And I'm really proud of that because there are regions across the country who have yet to have an elected female regional chief. And we've never had at the Assembly of First Nations an elected female national chief. So I come from a region that has always respected, honored, and valued the leadership of women because of our cultural values. And so that's something that I always keep close to my heart. I also, in terms of what it is, I think that continues to support and guide me are knowing the other women who are in my corner and making sure that, it's definitely, there's been moments where, friendships sometimes are for a season or you go through these different experiences in the workplace and relationships change. But there's always those people at the end of the day that if you need to talk to or you need to call or you just need a moment, it's always been knowing who those people are who are in my corner. And that those two things have really been what have continued to support and guide me through and navigate through the challenges that come being, an Indigenous woman, a woman, and having, responsibilities and of course a specific role and title that I uphold and that I take very seriously.
Thank you. I know we're going to come back to this concept of strength of community, particularly as we reflect on COVID-19, but those messages are so important. So thank you for sharing that. Nadia, turning over to you, what are the one or two things that you think about that helped you get to first?
Thanks, Tanya. Echoing the pleasure at being here with all of you, all the ones that I can see on my screen, and then the many that are out there listening to us. I think it's really fantastic that we can still connect and have these conversations even when we are in a global health pandemic, which we still are in. For me, the one thing that I have really clung to, and it's something that my mother used to say to me when I was in high school. So both of my parents immigrated to Canada from a small island in the Caribbean, St. Lucia. And for them, coming from a majority experience and landing in a place where they were no longer in a majority experience, and how they raised their children, and especially their girl children, myself and my sister, in that environment, really, I think, has grounded me in my success in the way that I move around the world, particularly when I sit still enough to listen and remember what their teachings were to me. So this whole idea of remembering who you are and remembering where you came from really resonates with me as well. And my mom used to say to me, be careful who you give your energy to, Nadia, because it's not going to be everybody who wants to see you succeed. And for me, that has been a very important lesson to keep in the back of my head as I move forward. I mean, I think it is fantastic for us to celebrate firsts and one of firsts. And, as soon as you say you're the first, somebody tries to define how that might not be true and how there might be another one and how you don't need to, you have no right to claim it or whatever it is, right? We had this discussion in our pre-call. But I think that, remembering that you need to define your own success. And you need to not let other people's definition of success or your worth or ability define how you see your success and your worth and ability really has helped me in times when we are climbing and facing those challenges in climbing, because the celebration part, here we all are, is fantastic. But behind that really is the push and the pull that happens for decades. I mean, Tanya, you mentioned that, we've been celebrating International Women's Day for decades and centuries. That was not always celebrated for all women, by all women. And so the trajectory of women's experiences and women coming into their own power and knowledge in spaces of authority and influence have been different. And for me, as I have moved forward and assumed my space, it has been very important for me to remember that other people's perception of who I am and what my worth is in those spaces don't have to define how I define that for myself, right? And you really need to protect that, your own energy in that regard, because there will be tough, for people who might be listening who are on the come up, there will be those times when it's not a celebration, when it's very far from being, and you really do need to stay grounded in what you know to be true about who you are, where you're going, and where you want to get to.
Great reminder. It's not a straight path up, especially I'm sure as a woman who was on a diplomatic mission to the US, you would have many stories to share in your time, but it's not a straight path up, and it's not the same path for all women. I appreciate you calling that out, because the experiences of women across race, ethnicity, ability can be very, very different. So thank you for calling that out. Katie, what about you? When you think about your path and your firsts, what stands out for you?
Sure. Well, let me echo Nadia and Kluane's warm greetings, and so great to be here. Thanks for including me. Like them, my firsts were largely shaped by my beginnings. But different than them. I didn't have a lot of influences in my young life that I could turn to for inspiration. I spent 10 years in undergraduate and graduate school, first person in my family to go to university. And that was the transformation that allowed me, coming from a small town, to see that opportunities for women ranged well beyond the ones that were visible to me as a young girl growing up. Getting started in my first career job, I was almost 30 years old. I had quite a lot of catching up to do. And I can see, with the benefit of my rearview mirror, and I want to make it clear that I see these things now, I had no idea at the time that these things would be influential ultimately in my career trajectory. But the first one was that because I was a little bit of a late starter to a professional career, I had some catching up to do. And so I worked really hard at expanding the scope and scale of all of my experiences. And that could have been, at the office, where I constantly tried to take on new things, explore new areas of the business, work on new files, whatever it was, a chance to learn and get more experience under my belt, because I could see in the world of work that experience was going to be a very important currency for advancement to next role. Part of it was, of course, I was trying to get my career on track, earn enough money to pay back my student loans, get myself on a firm financial footing. But ultimately, with the benefit of hindsight again, I can see that appetite for new experiences and new scope was something that really did help to shape some of my early firsts, and certainly laid the groundwork for the ones that came later. I think the second thing I would say is, and again, with the benefit of hindsight, I considered myself I've always considered myself quite a conservative person, but I can see now, looking back, that I was willing to take risks. I was willing to put myself forward for opportunities, partly because I needed to, but partly also because I wanted to. And fear of failure is always there in the back of your mind, self-questioning around whether or not you're truly qualified. But if not now, then when, was always the question I was asking myself. Not everything worked out as I might have wanted it to or planned it to, but over time I can see that those decisions to take smart risks and to advocate for myself around those new experiences and new scope increases really did, in the end, help to shape my advancement in a couple of really key moments in my career.
Thank you. And actually, in drawing or pulling a thread between all three of you in different ways, you've all talked about resilience. You talked about what you've learned from the people that have come before you, from your communities, from being first in certain spaces and taking that space in a way that that defines you as opposed to being defined by others. And so this resilience, I actually want to touch on, because I think as we are all gathered here today in our individual little on-screen boxes, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about and acknowledge the moment that we are in, which is this global pandemic. COVID-19 has disproportionately and negatively affected women the world over. Canada is no exception. We know through much reporting, and actually great reporting by RBC Economics that has launched another report just this week, through COVID-19, we've erased 3 decades of gains that women have made in the workplace. 3 decades, 30 years we have rolled back in this past year as a result of the pandemic. And yet we persist, and I do believe we persist. So as you think about the past year and what you've seen happen in your communities and in society, what have you learned about women and our roles at home, our roles at work, and our roles in society through this crisis? Nadia, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I want to acknowledge, what's been really hard through this pandemic, right? Like it's impacted everybody probably very differently, depending on geographically where we may be, depending on the type of work that we do, depending on the family structure we may have. So I want to acknowledge what's been hard. And I also want to acknowledge, when we think about, the healthcare system, for example, and the number of women who have been continuing to support us through this pandemic, that's incredibly important to acknowledge, because it is then at the same time, women that we see who have been, very deeply impacted, of course, professionally and personally through this pandemic, and equally so, if not more so, we look at our Indigenous communities across the country and the impacts that has been there. This is really about, as we move forward, and this is where, I think this becomes a responsibility that we all have, is thinking about what it is that does need to be created, in Canada and beyond, to ensure that women, that families, that human beings are supported. And, there's been a lot of really great work that's been done. There's been a lot of great, research and analysis, but things like basic income, things like ensuring that people have sick leave, some of those, whether it be earned or unearned privileges that exist in this country for some, need to be available to all. And let me be very clear, this isn't a political position or stance. This is very much about recognizing what we've seen and the layers that have been shared in terms of the realities that Canadians are living through, that there are a lot of inequities in this country. And so how do we find ways to make things better? Regardless of where we come from and the backgrounds that we have, how do we come together to say, wait a minute, like we can do more and we can do better and we need to do better? Those are the conversations that I'm really interested in having. Certainly we're seeing, young people across the country recognizing how important it is that we have these conversations. And when we talk about firsts, right, want to acknowledge that, the leadership that women and those who identify bring come from very different perspectives, very different lived experiences. The resiliency, the authenticity, the experiences with respect to family and the responsibilities that women have in family. And I'm not, to be clear, this isn't like the stereotypical, approach here, but to say that women have really specific and distinctive roles within each of our family units. And with that comes the ability to have very innovative approaches in how to deal with very complex and hard situations. So this is where I, love to see women stepping forward and really taking on new responsibilities. When we think about the word, what is it to be a leader? Like the way I've been raised has always been, it's not about a role or a title, right? It's about your values, who you are, and how you show up. And so this is really, I think, about a moment in time where we need to, as a society, as Canadians, as people, recognize that there are some really important approaches and innovations that we absolutely need to support women and to create that space. Especially for, right, Indigenous women, women of color, marginalized women. There are experiences, the life experiences that people have that are not comparable necessarily to what we may get in a post-secondary experience. And for myself, you know, I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to attend post-secondary, you know, to have, worked hard to earn 2 different degrees. But I'm also mindful of the people who haven't had those opportunities, right? Who haven't had the resources to do that, who may not, you know, who may be parents themselves trying to want to advance in that space and just may not have the resources to do so. So I think this is where, you know, you're hearing from the other women, and I love hearing the diversity and experience that we all have. That have led us individually and collectively to press forward and to advance and to share the solutions and to really, and I loved what Nadia, you had shared, like, it's not asking for what you want, it's being very clear about what needs to happen. So that's what I love to see. That's the energy that I think we need. And it isn't about asking for permission. It's, I think, giving ourselves the permission to move forward and to continue to lead however that may look.
Great. Nadia, what about you? As you reflect on COVID-19, what are your reflections on the role of women in and outside of a pandemic?
You know, my one takeaway, and this might seem very bleak to people, but sorry. You know, my one takeaway that I really hope, and Kluane, exactly what you said, you know, that we are really at an inflection point now, right? We cannot no longer say that we do not know. Nobody coming out of this global health pandemic can say that we did not realize the inequities that exist in our wonderful country that we call Canada. They are glaring for everybody to see. And for me, this idea of the strong woman trope, and I really do believe it's a trope, if we are not intentional about dissecting that and figuring out how we support women, all women, that come from different economic backgrounds, different circumstances, that have different goals and aspirations for their lives and the lives of their families, instead of spending the most time talking about how strong women have been and, you know, look at us all, you know, persevering and being resilient, that strong woman trope, right? It creates or it prevents us from having the real conversations around what it is that we need to do to come out of this pandemic on the other side towards truly building better for our country and the 50% of people, women, who live here. And I think that's hard, right? Because I think that, you know, that idea of a strong woman, I say it all the time. I mean, I'm guilty number one, right? This idea of a strong woman, this idea that, you know, we have been the primary caregivers, not just for our families, not just for our communities, but for our countries as frontline workers, as healthcare workers, as, right, this idea that we will figure it out. This idea that even if we decide to step out of the workforce, we're going to have a side hustle, you know, to make sure that we're bringing in something or that we can step back in quickly. The idea of being so strong that we can do it all on our own is really going to prevent us collectively from having a conversation at a structural and institutional level around what are the tools that we need to put in place institutionally in our country, with private, public sector and NGOs working together to figure out what that looks like for the future. So that's my one big takeaway.
That's really, you've given me a lot to think about there, because I think you're right. You know, the more you're the engine that keeps trying, people think maybe you're okay, right? Like, we're strong, we're good, we're okay, we're going to keep trying. And you're right, that can send a really sort of negative or contrary message to the systemic changes that we need to make as a country. I want to jump into some juicy questions we're getting from the audience, but first I want to get Katie, I want to get your take on your reflections on the pandemic and its impact on women in this country.
Sure. Well, I'll build on the comments of the ladies who before. Very, very wise advice there. And, just moving from Nadia's point, I'd say that, one of the flip side positive of the negative that of all the bad things that have happened to so many people, including so many women during COVID, is that now the issues associated with working women are on the front page of newspapers. Things that we have all known to be true for decades and decades, either through our own personal experiences or through the experiences of those that we love or close to, that women are overly represented on the front lines of the economy. They've been more exposed in the pandemic because they work in the exposed economy. They're double shift because I call triple shift. They work, they take care of families and households, and they're most often also in charge of elder care. So the bad news is that none of this is new. The good news is that it is front page news, and we are all talking about it. People are writing reports on it. The saddest part for me is, though, it was all predictable. We knew all of these things were going to happen to women when the pandemic began. The Prosperity Project got together mid last year to talk about what could be done to start to remediate the impacts of this pandemic on women. So we often talk about unintended consequences of the pandemic. These consequences were predictable and in many ways known because we had the statistics to know that women were overly represented in the exposed economy, that had the double and triple shift lives that were going to make working through this extremely difficult. All that was just allowed to happen. And now we are seeing the repercussions of this. In the report, you referenced RBC, but which is very, very good, but all kinds of people, dozens of other writers have spoken to this. For me, there are so many takeaways, but just to keep it brief here today, because I know you want to get on to other things. The two big takeaways for me are that as a society, we must embrace the notion that childcare and early childhood education is infrastructure. It is not a social nice to have. We can't get to work without a road, a bridge, a train, a bus. We similarly, as women, cannot get to work unless we know that our children are safe and well cared for. And so we've got to reframe the conversation around how society looks at the net social benefit of having children, which is shared across the entire economy. The benefit shared, the burden rests singularly on the families and primarily on the women who take on that work. So we really have to start to think about those types of enablers that are not things we should be cobbling together individually and trying to figure out on our own. We really have to think childcare is infrastructure. The second big takeaway for me is the acknowledgement now that virtual works, flexible works. We've heard dozens and dozens and dozens of companies, CEOs, being very, very positive about their productivity levels, their gains, how everything's working fine. Yes, there are some stresses and strains in the system. Obviously, innovation and collaboration has been down. Obviously, there are mental health impacts to us all being isolated. But if you look forward to the new world of work, there's now no excuse for the structural archetypes of the workplace where FaceTime and in early, out late become the hallmarks of what constitutes a great employee and someone deserving of a promotion. And I think that if we can wrap our arms around this and try to institutionalize And it's not simply just allowing for flexible work. Flexible work has been allowed in a lot of workplaces for many, many years, but it hasn't produced the kind of female advancement we had hoped for, because we have treated flexible work as a discount to full-time work, to regular work, to in-office work. We've got to get rid of those stereotypes. We've got to get rid of those biases. We have to revamp our performance systems and our promotion systems so that the idea that someone chooses flex over permanent is no longer something that's on their scorecard for advancement. So I think we have a chance to do this. We just have to do it right.
Yeah, and I would love to take the gender out of flexible work, right? There are women identified, men and men identified. They can all benefit
Everybody
from flexible work. They all have parents. Many of them have children. They have other family members to care for. So there's a huge opportunity for all of us to take advantage of that in a productive way. We've got a very interesting question from the audience that I want to put to you, and it sort of builds on the comments that you made. Does Canada encourage women to make breakthroughs? What's your view on that? Are we in a society and in a structure, does Canada encourage that?
Encourage what? Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of it.
Yeah, and my audio is bad, so I apologize. Does Canada encourage women to make breakthroughs?
I would say sometimes yes and sometimes no. Obviously, when you look at Canada, it's a very open democracy, a very inclusive democracy. Do we have tons of work to do on socioeconomic and racial equality? Absolutely, we do. But we at least acknowledge that we're aspiring to be a place that allows for equal opportunity. Having said that, there is a lot of structural impediment that exists, and I don't think it's particularly Canadian, but I do think there are structural impediments to the way the world works that makes it more difficult for women than it might be for men. I'll give you a simple example. Think the capital markets business, right? So this is a big part of financial services, big part of the investment business. There are lots of women making strides in that industry, but on average, women still remain underrepresented in a lot of those fields. And one of the things that people point to is that the workday begins sometimes before it's light outside. And for women with children at home that they've got to get off to school, my experience as a young mother was the worst hours of the day were between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. Because if one tiny thing went wrong, your whole day was blown. You couldn't get to work. You couldn't make the morning meeting. You had to make other arrangements. Whereas at the end of the day, you'd have a little time to plan. But the whole world of certain types of businesses revolves around early start to the workday. And I often have questioned why are those structural, and I use it as a very simple example, but how did those structural norms come to be? And is there any reason that we can't start to question some of them in order to make more room for women in different parts of the economy?
It's funny, reflecting on my days as a young mother, I kind of have hives when I think about it. And if my children are listening, it's not because I don't have children. Nadia, you have been a long time contributor, participant in the Canadian government. What's your view on this? Are we a country that enables breakthrough for women?
Yeah, and now that I no longer work for the government, I can tell you how I really feel. So that's awesome. Just joking. You know what? Listen, this is what I think. I actually don't think it's the job of the government to encourage breakthroughs for women. I think that it's everybody's job and everybody's role. And I think that it's a problem that women did not create. And I feel very strongly about this. And I know that it might be a very unpopular view, but it's not a problem that we created. So it's not really a problem for us to fix. Happy to help. But and in Canada specifically, I think that breakthroughs require discomfort and uncomfortableness. And I'm sure there are lots of people listening who have lived in the United States for much longer than I did. So, world according to Nadia, take it or leave it. But having lived in the United States, and especially in Atlanta, which has a particular energy, especially for Black women. What I can say is that Canadians, and this is not going to be revolutionary for people, we do not like uncomfortable. We don't do well with uncomfortable, right? Not so much. It doesn't kind of fit with our national image of niceness and properness, which, listen, again, having lived in the United States, I very much enjoy that value, love it. But it doesn't lend itself to disruption. And in particular, I don't think it lends itself well to disruption when you're talking about, in this example, women, so historically underrepresented groups, gaining access and gaining authority and decision-making power and assuming decision-making roles in spaces where they have not been, because as Katie said, what it will require is the uncomfortableness of not just having one conversation in your own company around, yeah, that 8:00 meeting, could we push it back to 9:30, for Nadia, because she's got her 8-year-old, and that's one conversation. And, I was certainly at Maple Leaf Foods, the answer would be, because I have an amazing CEO and COO, the answer would be, of course, no problem, That's not the uncomfortable conversation. The uncomfortable conversation, as Katie said, is looking more structurally at, well, why is it like this? And why is that the norm? And why is doing it differently seen as an exception? And how do we change that? And I think that is what breakthroughs require. And I think that in Canada in particular, if I look at it from a US perspective versus a Canadian experience perspective, we don't do uncomfortable very well. And I think that that's a barrier.
Mm-hmm. A great point. Actually, it's a great point, because we've got another great question here from the audience. But I'm glad you've taken us into the space of, in order to make change and have breakthroughs, you've got to break some glass. So let's talk about that. And this question comes to the audience, and it's directed at Kluane and Nadia, specifically for the following reason. Have you ever felt as though you've had to tone down your Indigenousness or your Blackness in order to advance and progress? And Kluane, maybe I can start with you.
I mean, in short, yes. That's, I think that's definitely something that, as we talk about having the uncomfortable conversations, right, or the hard conversations, and linking to the breakthrough question, that is always something that unfortunately, rears its head, and it shouldn't. I want to acknowledge, the Indigenous women who have been in leadership positions years before I, at a very different time when things were harder in a lot of different ways. When we think about now, there are moments where, and I would say, and I think this is a really important moment to really think about, and when we're talking about these issues with respect to what I think this really comes down to is about worldview. And the Indigenous worldview is a very different worldview than that of like a Western colonial worldview. And so when it, that particular situation, and it happens often, whether I turn it down or not, I would say I show up as me. Do I feel challenged showing up as myself by others? Yes, I do often. I think as women, we probably feel it every single day, every single one of us, regardless of who we are and where we come from. But it absolutely is a very different experience and some things that have been said to me by, you know, whether it be other elected leaders or people in positions of power, right? The things that have been said are like atrocious, and often don't get checked publicly, right? People often don't have to be held accountable. And it has been, I'd say, an interesting part of the journey to, and you mentioned this earlier, Nadia, like, you know, being mindful of where you put your energies. Like if women, as women, we addressed head on, probably in the way that maybe we would want to, every single moment that kind of stuff happens, like that would literally be all I would be doing. So it's not to say I don't address it, but I have to be, as women, which we always are, and those who identify, incredibly strategic as to how we do that. And, you know, lining it up and figuring out the ways that we're going to have it be addressed, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in public, whether it's walking down the street and someone says something inappropriate and you're like, excuse me, right? And it is, I think, that challenge as well. And I want to talk a little bit about stereotypes, right? If a woman is direct, it's just unacceptable. But when a man is direct, it's expected. Or when a woman shows emotion or passion, then she's emotional. But if a man can show passion or emotion, he's so sensitive and connected. Like, that's not okay. And I think that we need to really start to acknowledge the discrepancies in terms of when women show up and are very clear and direct and respectful and kind, but are still then challenged. Or, you know, it's so interesting because I would say the issues with respect to the unconscious bias that exists in terms of men and women. And I'm sure, like Katie and Nadia, you've had so many experiences where you're like, I did this and said this, but this guy said this, and somehow that's okay. But if I say it, it's not, all the time. So, you know, from the Indigenous worldview, I would say it becomes, it can be very, very challenging. And especially from an Indigenous woman's worldview. And there's so many different cultures and languages. So to be clear, we're not necessarily all under the same veil. But I will say this. When I try to explain this kind of concept of worldview, I'm going to give one really quick example. So if we were to look at a map and there was like a parcel of land when we're looking at this map, and it's like, from an Indigenous worldview, one would look at that parcel of land and maybe just say, okay, so it's there, right? Its role is that it's there. But perhaps from a Western colonial worldview, one could say, okay, what is that parcel of land? What could it be used for? Like, are we gonna, you know, is there development opportunity there? Are we going to be, you know, what's the long-term purpose of that land? And again, this isn't to say that there aren't Indigenous people who are looking at resource development and, you know, resource extraction like that. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that from that Indigenous worldview, the role of the land in a lot of cases is to just be, and that's it. And so this is where, when we get into these conversations about, you know, whether it's is the Indigenousness, do I feel like I have to turn it on or turn it up or turn it off? That's a really great question. I would say a lot of us as Indigenous people probably have to, you know, are made to feel that way. But my response will be like, it is so important. And for any of those women, I think, who are listening, regardless of if you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, like those moments where you're challenged to show up, you know, as to who you are and what your values are, like those are the moments I feel like where just showing up as yourself and being reminded that you don't have to turn anything on or up because of what someone else is doing, but just to take that moment to be grounded in you. Some ways that I do that are in moments where someone says something that is like so wildly inappropriate. There's little activities that you can do yourself, like tapping your knees with your hands at a board table and no one can see that, just to kind of get yourself grounded. Because I think that women are challenged in so many ways, and people don't necessarily understand what that feels like. So it's moments where I think others need to really check themselves in how they are approaching women and asking and approaching those questions of having women feel like they have to turn on or turn up or turn off, when that in and of itself is just wildly inappropriate.
Thank you. Nadia, what about you?
Everything that Kluane said.
Yeah.
all of those things. And if I have 1 minute, what I will add that might be different. Again, I do not speak for all Black women everywhere, so just want to make that clear. But for me and my family, and what I know to be true for many Black women my age who are first generation Canadian, although many are not, is that our parents immigrated here, and the way that we were brought up was to have, and I was looking on my phone because somebody just tweeted it this morning, and it's so interesting that we're talking about it. The way that we were brought up is to have a subtle, subconscious deference to whiteness. And so that's very different than what I heard Kluane say, right? For us growing up, my parents always said to me, Nadia, just keep your head down, look at what they're doing and do the same thing. Don't be too loud. Don't be too abrupt. Listen, figure out what music they're listening to and listen to that music, right? It was this subtle deference in order to be accepted, which worked for a long time. But what we are realizing now, or what I am realizing, is that if you do not show up as yourself, whether it happens in the first generation or the second generation, it will kill you. It is not sustainable. And so I, in particular, have decided that I will be showing up as me. And sometimes that might look like, the majority around the table. One of my favorite bands is U2. That's great. Might show up like that. Other times it will not show up like everybody around the table. My background, people commented all the time, oh, wow, it's such a colorful background. Oh, what's that? Being loud. When I get excited, I get expressive. I come from a family of, especially on my dad's side, both on my dad's side and mom's side, that were activists. And so I have particular points of view about things. And I refuse not to let those views be heard at the appropriate moment. Kluane is very right. If we did that all the time, every time, we would be not only exhausted, but that's all that we would be doing. But I get to decide, right? And I think that that's important. And it's a little bit of a difference, at least from my experience, being the daughter of immigrant parents who came here and was looking to have me have a different experience than they had. Right. They really tried to teach me to be deferential, and that is something that I have to unlearn, frankly.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's not the easiest question, but I appreciate that from the audience, and I appreciate your candor in your answers. So we have a short 6 minutes left, and I had promised that we were both going to learn from your firsts, but also celebrate them. And one of the questions from the audience I think is really important, which is, what is the action that you're most proud of that you've taken to open the door for other women? So the movement from first to many. Katie, let me start with you. What are you most proud of that you've done to open that door?
Well, I would say the thing that I've been doing, and it again, go back to our learned experiences. I didn't have a lot of female role models growing up in Oshawa. I also didn't have very many female senior executives to turn to. The hotel industry in those days was remarkably male dominated, particularly on the business side where I was. It was probably 16 years into my career before I met another woman at a boardroom table for a development deal. And so
which is amazing, because I've heard that women actually stay in hotels.
Women do stay in hotels. Lots more women run hotels. Lots more women are on executive committees of hotel companies today. But I'm older than our other two panelists here by quite a lot. So I'm actually dating myself with some of these anecdotes. But as a result of that, I made it a personal mission of mine to make myself available to as many women and men. I'm an equal opportunity mentor. But as many women as possibly would need me. I do this in a broad range of ways because I'm no longer an active executive. I'm still busy, but I have a lot of free flow time in my calendar to accommodate all of these young aspiring executives. And everybody has a different set of issues. Everybody is at a different point in their career. But the more time I spend with these women and young men, as I said, they are in my group as well, the more I can see the power of mentorship. And I had very important sponsors and champions in my career who really made a difference in my workplace experiences. But in this particular case, these are mostly people I'm not connected to through work. And so I'm helping them as much as I possibly can navigate the sort of things that I had to navigate. One of the things that is true is that we all are born and grow up essentially without a handbook, right? There's nobody who says, all right, here's what you need to learn in order to be a woman in business. Here's what you need to learn in order to be a parent. Yes, there are books we can read, and generally we have touchstones that we look to, but as we've all found out, some of the thorniest issues that we're called upon to cross over in our careers are all related to our own personal set of circumstances and the way we show up to the world, the way we approach our problems, the situations we find ourselves in. And as Nadia and Kluane have said, sometimes this is very uncomfortable. And so just making myself available on a confidential basis to speak to people, to help them navigate. That not only has this been a way for me to kind of give back all of the sort of success that I've been lucky enough to enjoy, but it's also a wonderful way for me to continue to learn and stay current. Most of my mentees are quite a bit younger than me. I always make sure that they know reverse mentoring is part of the deal. So when they have special expertise in certain things, I always ask them to become my teacher on those subjects, and they're more than happy to do that. So it's a win-win, but it's something that I'm going to continue to do as long as I'm able.
Thank you. Okay, Kluane first, and then Nadia. In a minute left.
In short, I have always remained committed to staying connected with young people. I recognize that I'm a new generation of leaders myself, but certainly, on the team that I am honored to lead in our regional office, the work that I've done with young people, in particular young women, that I really feel that it has to be more than saying we're going to do it. You have to actually do it. And so I feel that all of us can, and a challenge to all those listeners, find a way to bring a young person into the meeting. Find a way, especially a young woman. Let's be clear, young women. But bringing them into that space to ensure that we are building and supporting and creating those relationships so that they're able to in turn continue on in their important work.
Awesome. Nadia, bring us home.
I would just say, now that I have the ear of some of the decision makers around certain tables, most of whom are men, I make sure that I talk to them about the young women in particular that are hidden in plain sight in terms of promotion, in terms of opportunity, in terms of belonging and having a seat at that next table for them. That is the one thing that I have committed myself to continue to do, because the fact of the matter is that it's the people who are inside of the room making the decisions that are going to have to, unfortunately decide that they're bringing more people in, right? And so I'm remain committed to speaking the names of those people who deserve seats at the table inside those rooms with the decision makers.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all. Amazing women, examples of, for all the young women out there that you mentor and sponsor and that know you and are walking with you in this journey. You are all, for them, I can't be it if I can't see it, and they can see it through you. So thank you for being part of this. Happy International Women's Day. And Anita, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you. And to all of you, thanks so much for joining us on this early celebration of International Women's Day. Kluane, Katie, and Nadia, thank you for taking the time to share your experiences, your wisdom, and your achievements with us. And for all of the leaders that are out there listening and watching today, I loved the call to action from Nadia for all of us to lean into the discomfort and really question whether the operating practices that we all take for granted are conducive to women's advancement. Tanya, thank you so much for your guidance of today's conversation. Guests, we hope that you will join us for some of our upcoming events. On Thursday, March 11th, we'll host a discussion on trends in healthcare featuring Bain's World Healthcare Practice Lead, Tim van Biesen, in conversation with Canadian Health Executive Jody Butts. He's going to share insights from his international work, explore the vast implications of combating the coronavirus, increase government funding, and building greater resilience in global and domestic supply chains. And then on Wednesday, March 17th, we'll be joined by panelists from the Ontario Mining Association, Avalon Advanced Mineral Materials, and others for a discussion on the changing landscape of critical mineral supply chains and the opportunities they afford Ontario as part of Canada's revitalization and growth efforts. Thank you to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and livemeeting.ca for making it possible to come to you virtually today. Thank you again to Canadian Bankers Association and PwC for sponsoring today's event. Guests, thank you for joining us. Stay healthy and stay safe.